With all the social, political, and economic turmoil of recent years, we may feel tempted to shield our children from it all. We want to make their lives safer and easier. But when we try to smooth a young person's path, what are the risks to their development? And what are we teaching them about how to respond to others' actions and to their own mistakes? Hello, I'm Sally Aneri, and welcome to Fearless Forward, the podcast that asks leaders how they've faced their fears. Today, we're crossing the Atlantic again, and I'm in conversation with a Harvard University lecturer who's doing a remarkable job of helping young people move through fear, stress, and ambiguity at the most formative time of their life. Alexis Redding is faculty co-chair of higher education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She researches, teaches, and advises on student development, mental health, and the transition from college to work. In 2021, she co-authored her first book to challenge the idea that young people today are coddled, resistant to growing up, and not developing as rapidly as past generations. Reframing the late teens and 20s as a necessary period of experimentation and learning, the book, titled The End of Adolescence, The Lost Art of Delaying Adulthood, draws in part on a research project involving a lost archive of recorded student interviews from the 1970s, which shows that there's actually a remarkable resonance between generations and nothing new in young people's struggles with stress, loneliness, isolation, and anxiety about the future. Alexis' current focus on the mental health landscape of college life and what lecturers and leaders can do to support students is at the heart of her latest book, Mental Health in College, What Research Tells Us About Supporting Students, where she shares field-tested research, not abstract theory. She's also written widely on the subject for publications such as the New York Times, the Harvard Business Review, Fast Company, and Teen Vogue. And she recently gave her first TEDx talk on the subject of being human, the real secret to adulting, and why we keep giving young adults the wrong advice. In our conversation, we explore how fear shows up for young adults. Fear of not measuring up, of making the wrong choice, of speaking honestly about their struggle. And we talk about how Alexis' own life experiences have influenced her outlook on her life and work. Alexis, in your recent and first ever TEDx talk, there was something that struck me, something you said, and it was this. When we retell our stories in too simple a way, we leave out the part that young people most need to hear. So I'm curious, what have you found in your work with young people today that they most need?
So I love that part stood out to you. I think that was one of the most important takeaways for me as well. And just as grounding for your reader, what I was doing when I discovered this moment is that I had this archive of interviews with students conducted throughout their 20s. And I rediscovered that these materials existed and reconstituted an archive that I could study along with my colleague, Dr. Nancy Hill. And when we were done with our study of what had been said on the tapes, we wanted to meet the people who had been part of that study and to give them the opportunity to hear the recordings of themselves 50 years in the past, this sort of perfect time capsule moment. And what was so striking after they listened to the recordings themselves is how little they recognized of the struggle that they had gone through. On the tapes, in real time, what they had captured was loneliness and insecurity and fear about the future, the pressure that they felt to have things all figured out. And by the design of the study, before they even listened, we had them retell the story of what they remembered of college. So we knew that their memory of that had been tidied up, sort of polished around the edges. They had lost the emotion of just how hard it was. And so what was fascinating is after they listened, one of the first things they said was, I didn't remember the emotion of it. I didn't remember it having been so hard. And it was so striking to me that they would have such a crystal clear memory of the details, but they would lose the intensity of what it's like to figure things out. And what felt so meaningful to me as someone who studies young adulthood and studies the college experience is I realized that because they didn't remember the emotion when they were telling their stories to the young people in their lives, they were leaving out everything that actually mattered. So they were saying to their kids, their grandkids, their students, it'll all work out, it'll be okay. Oh, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do either, but ultimately I found a way, which is a nice, tidy story. And if I am a young person in the midst of figuring things out, I don't need you just to tell me that there's a happily ever after at the end. I need you to tell me, oh, I remember what it felt like to have no idea if it would turn out okay, or to tap into the emotion of, I know what it's like to be here and to be uncertain. One of the things we forget about young people in particular is they haven't had the lived experience to know that the job they don't get or the, challenging setback they have, they don't have the context to recognize that this is just part of the ups and downs. And so everything feels so big and so derailing and so jarring. If we don't tell them, how we navigated those experiences ourselves, how do they know? How do they have the context to do that? And so my hope is that through telling stories like this, we can channel some of that emotional valence into our conversation so that young people don't feel so alone in that experience.
And I'm imagining, thinking of my own, I have twin sons who are now in their early 30s, but, I think something I learned myself when they were in their teens was the power of listening. It might help in the right moment to say, it'll all work out, maybe, it's not a terrible phrase. Timing is everything. But when young people or anyone comes to you with something that is bothering them, no matter how big or small it may seem to you, I guess the power is in holding the space for them to express that and feel as if, I guess, they're not alone.
Absolutely. I think it is so hard for us because we want to help. And when the young people in our lives come to us and they are struggling and they are scared, we want to jump to, here's what I can tell you. Here is why it will be okay. We want to cheerlead and make sure that they, feel the support that they need to get to the other side. And the first and most important thing we can do is exactly what you just named, is sitting and listening and hearing what that feels like. And indeed, these two things can hang together because in the listening, that is the opportunity to recall what it felt like for us and to connect to those moments of insecurity and uncertainty and just the humanity of trying to ask and answer big questions of who am I? What do I want for my life? How am I going to get to the other side? And who do I want with me on the journey? All of those big developmental questions. If we can lean into listening first, I think we can help in a much more profound way. But oh my goodness, is that hard when we want to help them get to the answer, the solution. We want to ease their struggle when part of what it is that we want to do for the young people in our lives is teach them that it's okay to be in the moment of struggle and learn the skills and strategies for getting to the other side, because we won't be there through each and every pivot point that they have or each and every struggle that they experience.
And when you speak of this, are you speaking of it as, a developmental psychologist as you are and the work that you do? So if in that sense, if you like, a professional context, and or are you thinking of it also from the parental perspective? Adult young person relationships, if there's going to be any kind of feeling with in those conversations, then there has to be empathy, right? And empathy comes from our own personal lived experience. So yes, putting ourselves back in their shoes and I guess letting go of the desire to fix, manifesting our love in a different way, not wanting to take it, take their experience away from them or solve it for them, but help them through it.
That's such a good question, and I'm not sure that I can decouple the two sides anymore. Uh, Working as a developmental psychologist and spending now 25 years working with and studying young adults in this transitional period, especially around college, it is hard to set that aside. So I think that very much informs the conversations that I have. It's it's fascinating when these two things collide. So I have a cousin with whom I'm very close. Her son just went away to college for his first year. So what I'm getting are texts from her about the challenges, the very real, very typical developmental challenges of being in this moment of transition. And I sort of have to have that moment of remembering, like, there is the textbook answer to this, and then there is the answer in a text at 11 o'clock at night because a person I love is struggling to support the young person in her life. And I think that I'm glad those two things hang together and I can't decouple them. But it would be interesting to be able to do that and to separate those out.
I guess it's human being to human being, isn't it? And remembering, I suppose, our role in all of that. Very difficult. I know from personal experience, extremely difficult as a parent, but also in the work you do, to which I can hear, I think we can all hear you are deeply committed. How do you personally manage those relationships on a day-to-day basis? How does that play out for you? How does this work, if you like, manifest for you?
I'm very fortunate in my role because I help to lead our program in higher education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so I have graduate student advisees and I have undergraduate advisees at the college. And so part of the work that I do is sitting with young people and doing what you do, coaching them, holding the space in which they can feel seen and heard and valued, to listen to what they're going through, and to myself, hold back the here's the answer, here's what to do, and to ask the right questions of how they're feeling about it, how they tease things apart. Because I'm dealing with so many young people, between the ages of about 18 and 25 would be the typical group that I'm working with, I often remind myself of the developmental psych lens of what's going on in terms of brain development in this moment. And so what we know is, as we are progressing from 18 to 25 exactly, the prefrontal cortex is in the process of finishing up its development. And there are things that we can and can't do until that is sort of done. One of them is holding multiple realities at once and sort of living in the gray area. That's a skill that we develop as our brain develops. And so it's so important to remind myself as I'm sitting with someone who's 18 or 19 years old, and they are being tasked with choosing their major, choosing their career, thinking about the future, to remember that developmentally they're at a moment where I'm asking them to do something that's really, really misaligned with a skill set that is still in the process of developing. And so there's this other piece that really tweaks how I talk to them. So one of my favorite theories from the literature is called self-authorship. It's becoming the author of your own life, which is just beautiful phrasing. And part of what happens as you become self-authoring is you are able to tamp down on the voice of authority, parents, society, what you should do, or the messages you're receiving about what you should do. And it's not that you tune those out entirely, but you're able to begin filtering those out and to start with a question of, but does that fit me? My 18-year-old student who is sitting with me is not yet self-authoring. And so I have to recognize that I am one of those potential authority figure voices. And if I say to somebody, it sounds like you're really enjoying your sociology class. Have you thought about what kind of career you could have leaning into a degree in sociology? That would be exactly the wrong thing to ask them. Because what they would hear as an 18-year-old who is not yet self-authoring is, you should do something in sociology. And so the easy tweak to make is, it sounds to me like you're really enjoying your sociology class. I know that people who study sociology sometimes pursue careers in X field and sometimes pursue careers in Y field. Have you explored either of those? Not giving one answer, giving two. Because then I'm not an authority figure making a singular suggestion, I'm opening the door to exploration. It is such a simple tweak to make in how we offer advice, and it actually makes all the difference.
And would it be kind or unkind to a brain in that stage of development to open the field wider and say, never mind about sociology, what do you love?
No, I think it would be ultimately incredibly kind. I think it's very hard, though, for a brain in that moment always to name it. And so I think the question can be even further refined to, where do you what homework assignment do you want to do first? What is the assignment or reading set that you are doing when you lose track of time? Asking about the flow state that they achieve, or asking the opposite. What is the paper that you put off for last? What is the class that you dread going to? And really getting not at the naming, what do you love, but what does it feel like in the moment? And I think that can sometimes be easier and can be more decoupled from the what is the right answer? What am I supposed to say? What is the expectation? But carving out the space to do that is transformative for young people as they're trying to figure things out. And so much of what I do in sitting in my office with young people is giving them permission to start to name why something they've been told about themselves does not feel authentic or true.
Do you encounter that often?
All the time, absolutely. And not just in contemporary work, but in the archives and listening to students. And I have interviews going back to the 40s and 50s. And what we hear all the way back, 85 years worth of recordings with college students, is I've been told I'm good at STEM, the sciences, so I should be a doctor. And in the 40s, in the 50s, in the 70s, and today, there are young people who are sitting with that story of who they're supposed to be and naming, but I don't like blood. I don't like to see people in pain. I can't imagine spending the next 40 years of my life doing that. And what's so important to recognize, because it's such a consistent pattern, is that the grown-ups in their lives who are suggesting these things have the best of intentions. They're trying to uplift. You have a talent, you have a skill. There's something I see in you. There's potential. But my not yet self-authoring kid who's hearing that doesn't hear that it's an option. They hear that it's a prescription. And it's amazing how much of a burden we can lift when we ask, but does that feel like it fits you? Or what does that feel like as you begin to imagine what that life would be like?
Self-authorship, being understood, following your path. Alexis, is there something about your personal story that brought you into this work? I'm just curious.
This is one of those interesting things that you don't see until you look back across your life. I did not set out to study the college experience, the supports that young people need, but I found myself continually drawn back in my career to these questions, starting all the way back. So, my first career, I was a college counselor. And so I sat with young people who were 16, 17, and 18, asking these big questions about what do they want for their future at a moment when their brain development was not quite ready to ask or at least answer the exact question we were asking them. And what I saw in that experience is that my students, as they transitioned into college, they were coming back and they were telling me about their experiences, and they were more bruised in that moment than I had expected them to be. And I started to wonder what was happening on the college side where they weren't getting the supports that they needed. And my grand plan was I was going to leave the work that I had been doing for 10 years, get a 1-year master's degree, answer these questions for myself, and go right back out into the field to return to college counseling, which was work that I loved doing. And what I found once I started my master's program was not just that I loved being the one to ask the questions and to do the research, but I also didn't think that the right questions were being asked otherwise, because I was so deeply grounded in practice. And so many people who were leading the research studies on what young people needed or how they transitioned or how to support them in college had just a pure academic lens that didn't come from the depths of sitting with students who were struggling and telling you their stories in a very personal way. And I realized that if I wanted answers to these questions, I was the one who needed to ask them. And so I transitioned into doing my doctoral studies. And now we're 15 years later, and I train the people who do the work of supporting students in transition as they're moving into college. So solving the exact problem that I had seen in practice all those years ago. What's interesting is because I didn't set out to do this, why? Why do I care so deeply about the process of supporting students in college? And it is because I had such a terrible college experience myself. It was really not the experience I would wish on any of my students. And I think we all somehow study the thing or gravitate towards the thing that we're trying to make sense of for ourselves. And we're very fortunate if that thing then can be in service to others. And I believe that this is. But it is sort of making meaning out of my own process of growing up and my own experiences being bruised in trying to figure out who I was and what I wanted for my own life and all of those pivot points.
And I suppose, your direct experience of realizing how very important that was to you.
Yes, absolutely. I think now the developmental psychologist in me can understand the harm done to an 18-year-old or the challenge in those moments or what a difference it makes for the one person who shows up and listens and supports and gives you what you need.
It feels like a mission. Does it feel like that to you?
I'm not sure I've named it as such, but I like that idea. I like the idea of it being a mission. I think when you see clearly that there is an easy thing that we can do differently to make life easier for other people, maybe it's hard for that not to become a mission. And because I've had the privilege not just of working with young people, but with their families, I know how deeply committed families are to offering the supports and not always knowing how to do it right. And how frustrating that is to care with your whole being about supporting someone else and not quite understanding why it's not working or what should you do. I mean, when I have the privilege of giving keynotes for our family weekends here at Harvard for our undergraduate students. So this is an assembled group of about around 1,200 to 1,500 family members who come to the college to see their kid, their student in this new chapter of their lives in the middle of their first semester of their first year. And I get to stand on stage and tell them, here's what's normal and typical about the hard things that are going on. And it is, even from the stage, I can see the relief that sort of washes across the audience of, oh, that thing, that call home of, I don't know if this is the right fit for me. I don't know if I should be in college. I don't know if I'm doing it right. I'm having trouble finding friends. That's typical. There's not something wrong that I have to fix. It's amazing. And there are lines of people that form after the keynote, and person after person wants to tell me, okay, but my kid is experiencing this. Is that also normal? Is that also typical? And you just see how much everybody wants to get it right. But the broader narrative is so dismissive of parents. There are so many stereotypes about the micromanaging parent or the helicopter parent or the snowplow parent or bulldozer parent. I mean, we have all of these sort of stereotypical narratives for the parent who's trying to help. And I think we lose sight of the reality that these are just human beings trying to get it right for someone they care deeply about. And I think for me, that has to be part of the mission of normalizing the story of what it is to try to support when you're not quite sure what matters. And I can't think of anything more harmful than dismissing or minimizing the emotion of the parents as well.
Where do you sit with the notion, the idea that we have to allow young people to make their own mistakes?
I absolutely agree with that notion. I think that it is so hard for us to sit back from the vantage point of experience and to allow mistakes to happen. I think it is also an opportunity to think very deeply about what are the mistakes that we learn from, in which context do we do that learning to make sure that the mistakes aren't derailing. And it is also important to think about privilege in who can make mistakes and still be supported. And so because I work with students in the college context, what I know is that there is additional privilege there of making mistakes and having setbacks because the college years are set up as a holding space in which we teach people to rebound. So when there is a misstep, when there is a mistake made and it's handled internally to the college, that is something that might not be part of, the story of who you are beyond. But those mistakes, when they happen in society, might end up with, a mark on your actual public record. And so thinking about who has the privilege to make those mistakes and in what context are those mistakes, can they be genuinely instructive as opposed to derailing us? So in the book that I wrote with my colleague, with Dr. Nancy Hill, called The End of Adolescence, we have one chapter about setbacks that young people experienced, and we focus on 4 of the students from the 1975 branch of the study. And of the 4, 3 of them made mistakes or had challenges that were within college. And the college allowed them to regroup, course correct, fix things. And one of them had a mistake that happened in the real world, beyond the bounds of college. And that student was never able to regroup from it. There weren't structures and scaffolding in place for that to happen. And so that to me was a very powerful takeaway, especially because we've now been able to see how these folks' lives unfolded, from their interview when they were struggling in the 70s to today in 2025. The ones who were able to course correct in college, it didn't negatively impact how their lives unfolded. But the one that happened outside of the college context didn't come back for an interview, but what we've been able to read about how things unfolded, it really did impact him for the long term. And so I want students to be able to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and course correct and explore. But I also want to name and recognize the limitations that some folks will have doing that. And that is not just about making mistakes. It's about making mistakes in a context where we can course correct.
Yes, in a, I suppose, what you might call supportive environment, which is both the college and, I suppose, the family home, a bit of both, perhaps. And everyone's individual circumstances are different. I suppose I was also thinking about making wrong choices around, courses that you might pursue, careers that you might have a go at. Where someone wants to do something for no apparently good reason. They just want to do it, and nobody else wants them to do it apart from them.
I think, and I may be answering this question more from an American vantage point than beyond the US, but at least here in the US, I think we put too much pressure on the story of the right major or the right first career. We tend to focus, because there is more room for exploration on the front end during the college years, and because many of our students don't declare until they're already with us, declare their major or their concentration, we tend to tell a simple story again about you will study this, and this is the career you will pursue, and so don't get it wrong. The reality, of course, is quite different, that what you study in college or university here in the US does not necessarily dictate your career path unless it's a highly professionalized path like medicine. And even then, there are opportunities to course correct if you did not study pre-med, but you decide that's your passion later. And so the student who studies anthropology or sociology or art history, like I did, I was not preparing for a career as an art historian. I was preparing a set of skills that continue to serve me today. And so I think we can pivot the conversation away from what is the major to what are the skills. And by doing that, even if we don't totally understand the path, or even if it changes along the way, it's not that we have this sunken cost of having studied one thing when we're pivoting to another. It's that we've learned a set of skills that are absolutely transferable. And we see that again with the first job. And so many of my students, particularly my graduate students or my seniors at the college, are panicked about getting the right first job because they've been told a story about that is what they will do with their lives. But they will have several careers. That is the likelihood at this point. With a longer lifespan, with the changes that have come through AI, the changing marketplace, the changing workforce, that we don't have to just think in terms of what is the job you want for life, is what is the first job, what are the skills you will build, and then you can always pivot. And relieving some of that pressure from getting it right the first time out when you have no experience in the working world and you don't know what truly is going to fit. I think that also can make a difference for young people and for the rest of us as we're supporting them. That, the first 2 to 3 years out of college, what an incredible opportunity to continue the exploration and to find a role that is meaningful in some ways, but it doesn't have to mean everything.
Digging a little bit into parental interface, relationships, in this complex world, difficult, unpredictable world that we live in, with so much intense change, what do you notice about the impact of that on a parent's capacity to trust their young adult children to make the right choices?
Yes, I think that the stakes feel so high for parents. And there has been an opportunity in the past for parents to trust that their children will have a more stable and secure, better in quotes, future than they did. And that's no longer the case. And so it's really important to recognize that parents are scared that if their children make mistakes or get off path, that the consequences will be dire. But what we are seeing and what is honestly keeping me up at night is the way parents are manifesting some of that right now in an attempt to protect their children without any blame for why they're feeling that way. As a developmental psychologist, I'm worried about some of the choices that they are making to try to quash some of that anxiety. So, the thing that is I can't let go of is the use of something called Life 360. So, it's an app on your phone that allows you to track your loved ones and know where they are. And this can be incredibly helpful for keeping loved ones safe on a long road trip, knowing where they are. There are many, many examples of how Life 360 has been beneficial to families. But the way that parents are talking about how they use it with their college students in particular is developmentally problematic. So, what we are actually seeing is parents who are tracking when their kids wake up, making sure they got to class on time for their 9 a.m. class. Are they going to the dining hall? What time do they get back from their dormitory into their dormitory at night? And so there are all sorts of developmental puzzles around this. So, what is it like to be tracked in a moment when you are supposed to be developing a sense of freedom? What does it mean not to be able to make your own mistakes of oversleeping and missing your 9 a.m. class, and then living with the consequences of that, of having to talk to the professor, having to get notes, having to catch up, not being able to perform as well on that section of the course because you didn't set your alarm or you snoozed it too many times. Those are life lessons that we can learn safely in the college context and be okay. But the parent who needs to know that their kid got out of bed on time when they are 18 is depriving that young person of that opportunity. And I'm also thinking about college being a space where you get to explore and try out new clubs and try out new centers and figure out who you are and what does it mean if your parent at all times can know exactly the name of the building you are in and ask you what it is that you're doing. It is depriving that young person of the opportunity to explore and thrive in this new context. And it is only coming from a place of love and concern and fear. And I don't think there's a recognition of what we are depriving a young person of when we have that level of micromanagement. If we truly can't trust an 18-year-old to navigate the daily life of college, then they might not be ready for college. And so we have to figure out, where is the bound?
Yeah, so coming back, if I may, to what you were saying just now about developing skills. Skills that might be applicable in choices around careers, what kind of work you want to do, but also life skills. I wonder, in the end, which is the more important? Perhaps they're equally important. Very difficult to measure, but life skills are at least as important, are they not, as the skills that are required to sustain a good and maintain a good, successful career. Emotional intelligence, resilience, resourcefulness, sense of self-awareness, standing on your own 2 feet, these kinds of things can carry you an awful long way, can't they? And it does sound, from what you've described, as the, dare I say, well-meaning parents may be unwittingly depriving their children of learning these things. So, in your position, what do you have in mind then to speak to some of these very real things that are happening for good reason, from a place of fear, to support parents to manage their own fear better?
Yes, I think that's such an important question. And the answer is a simple one. It goes back to where our conversation began, which is telling the whole story and helping people to understand those moments of insecurity and not yet having things figured out. For me, what I've seen is that simply by helping parents to understand what is real and normal and typical about the hard of college can take some of that pressure away. So, to recognize, for example, what we now know from 85 years worth of research is that the first year of college is actually, for most people, a very lonely period of transition. When you are uprooted from the deep, long-standing friendships of home, when you are separated from your family, even if you don't move away to college, you're sort of entering a world in which they are not with you. That process of figuring out, like, who am I in this new place? What are the new relationships I'm going to build? Is one that feels profoundly lonely. But that is okay, and that is typical, and that is expected. Because we don't talk enough about that, because we only talk about loneliness as an epidemic somehow that is new and unique, parents understandably panic when their kids call home for the first time and say, I'm having trouble with my friends. My roommate and I are not clicking. I haven't really found my people. If we can name and normalize that of, you know what, around October or November of the first year of college, your kid is going to call home and feel lonely, and that's okay. We have removed the panic from that moment. And what's equally important about all of these opportunities to sort of name and normalize is that by doing that, we also empower parents to recognize when something is not typical, when their student is struggling too much. And that is, of course, our greatest fear when it comes to young people with the rates of suicidality as they are today. We never want to miss something and to underreact. And so, by making typical the normal developmental challenges, it's easier to see when something really rises to the level of needing critical care. So, a parent does not need to panic when somebody is feeling lonely in the first semester of college. That's expected. So let's have a very different conversation there. But when that loneliness persists into year two, when the student starts disconnecting and stopping trying to build those relationships, that's when we might be having a very different kind of conversation. I recently spoke with someone who's a dean of a college, a dean of students, who had a parent fly in from California because she was so worried about her son. And she had called the dean and said, I'm coming in. I'm very, very concerned about what's going on. So this dean is panicked. What's happening with this? Do I need to keep eyes on him? And the parent shows up from California over to the East Coast, comes into her office and says, my son tells me he's lonely. And that is a parent who is panicked genuinely because they don't know that that is okay and that every other kid on that dormitory hallway or in that dormitory is having some version of that. If not in that moment, has had it 2 weeks before, will have it 2 weeks after. And so to me, it is about naming and normalizing, changing the conversation, not allowing a narrative to stand of college will be the best 4 years of your life. Like that does not help us on a day-to-day basis because we might have some of the best moments, but we're also going to have hard times because growth and change and transition and transformation, those are all hard things and are expected to be hard.
And I wonder if there's some education, perhaps, or at least sharing around the difference between caring deeply and then moving into overcare. Like any beautiful quality that gets overplayed, it then can become harmful, can't it? So this is a rich conversation, isn't it? There are so many aspects. I'm speaking not just for our own conversation, which I'm thoroughly enjoying, Alexis, but I mean the wider conversation that on campuses such as yours, both with the students, with the parents, with an understanding of what's at stake, and also an understanding of perhaps the wider sense of perceived threat, in the world that must be influencing all of this. So, a rich and deeply important conversation. I'm imagining quite resource intensive, if I may get into some of the practicalities. But I mean, if you're going to build this work, you presumably need the resources to do it. I mean, what do you have a sense of the size and shape of it going forward?
I mean, right now, it's such a privilege to be doing more keynotes and to be having wider audiences, just to be able to share this message. I started by doing a lot of talks local, at Harvard and in our community. And I've now had the opportunity to really expand, and I'm starting to travel a lot more to colleges around the country to do keynotes in person, to do things virtually. I've also launched a new Instagram called Mental Health in College. The @ is MH in College. And this is aimed at parents and trying to name and normalize what's going on. So I think these are meaningful messages to be able to start to disseminate. And I don't think it has to always be as intense resource wise of spreading the conversation, but ultimately I think it will need to be. And I think that was also what brought me to the TEDx stage. I think by nature, I'm not a person who loves to be in photographs, to be recorded. I tend to be a little bit more shy. But I got to the point in sharing this work on a smaller scale, recognizing that it is a broader message that I think is important for people to hear, and leaning into / trying to overcome those fears and limitations of myself to be able to recognize that if the message needs to be shared and I'm the one to share it, then I need to get on bigger stages in order to do it. And so I've really been trying to lean into that.
Well, congratulations that you are facing your fears around that. And for you personally, what are those fears?
I think it is such a gift to do this work and to work with these stories of people who gave so selflessly of their stories in the 1970s, and to have worked so hard to resurrect this archive and to digitize this archive. I think one of my fears would be not to have impact. I see so clearly things that have made a difference in the lives of my students and the families with whom I've worked, that it would be such a disservice to the people who shared their stories not to be able to uplift those things. And so I think that's one of the fears I have now, of staying in the academy and sharing these messages only with my colleagues or only in an academic forum. I think the messages need to be broader. And so that is really what I'm trying to do.
So the fear of not having an impact, the need to have the impact needs to be greater than that fear, right? Yeah. And speaking of, how did it feel to be on stage for your first ever TEDx recently?
So that was an interesting moment. I think in the lead up to the TEDx, I knew that I was absolutely pushing at a growth edge for myself of being recorded. I do a lot of talks. I do a lot of talks for very large audiences. This was a small audience of who was in the room. This was about 300, 350 people. But I knew there would be, I think, 5 or 6 video cameras in the room. That is totally beyond the realm of what my typical experience daily life is. And then there was, a still photographer with a big long telephoto lens. And that's a lot for me. But I kept telling myself, this is an important message. This is a message you want to share. You just have to get over this fear. And you only have to get over it once. If you'll just do it the one time, rip off the Band-Aid, you'll be fine. And I worked harder to prepare for this talk than I've prepared for any talk in my life. And I was ready. And I was fascinatingly not scared in the lead up. I mean, I had committed to doing it. And so the night before, I was fine. That morning, I woke up and I was actually really excited and trying to lean into that. And the little voice in my head that was like, cameras are there, was, pulsing. I was like, shh, shh, quiet. We agreed. Like I've signed the disclosure. We are in it now. And I was the first one up. Even backstage, I was excited. Like this was a moment of growth. And my wife was sitting in the front row along with 3 of our dear friends. My best friend was texting me back and forth. I'm ready. This is the most ready I will ever be. And I walked out and I stepped onto that iconic red dot on the stage. and I looked out at the audience, and I was fine for a second. And then my knees started to shake. And I've never had that. I've never experienced that level of, first of all, my body just betraying me in that moment. And I sort of looked down. I'm like, I wonder if people can tell that my knees are shaking. But I realized you have two options now, like lean into the fear and choke and don't deliver this talk that you have been working so hard on, or plant your feet and don't move so you don't fall over and deliver the talk. And I went with option B, but I think for the first 75 seconds of the talk, if you don't know me, you might not know. But if you know me, you can see that I am just standing there in terror of this moment. And it wasn't just the cameras, it was, this is the moment to uplift the work, and I need to get it right. And I had put so much pressure on myself to get it right, which is exactly the kind of thing I tell my students and my families not to over-index on. Like, there will be other opportunities, but I had just put so much weight on doing the stories justice that my body felt it. And at some point, I had to just let it feel it and deliver the talk on quaking knees anyways. And now I know I can.
Well, you did a great job, but I don't know you personally well, so I can understand that those who do might have spotted that first 75 seconds, but you did a great job. And planting your feet, grounding your feet. The body doesn't lie, but it can be helped by grounding your feet and doing it anyway. So yeah, congratulations. And there'll be many more to come. It's the beginning.
I hope so. At least now I know how to overcome that particular rebellion of the body. I had a very old friend of mine who teaches communication and public speaking who watched the talk and had no idea, how terrified I was, and knows that I speak a lot. And so it hadn't crossed his mind that I would have been as nervous as I turned out to have been. And so he wrote a very thoughtful message about, if there was one critique I would have, is you seemed rather planted in place.
That's how I survived.
I was planted in place so I didn't fall over, because that was the only option in the moment.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So, given where you are now, in the middle of this, I want to call it wonderfully evolving time of your life, with so many important things that are important to you happening, work that you love and are passionate about, taking it forward. What does Fearless Forward mean to you?
I think for me, it is moving forward as if we are fearless and trying to recognize that sometimes the best, the most important, the most transformational things we can do, we have to do through fear. And we can't wait for the moment when that fear is gone to be ready for whatever the next thing is. Sometimes we have to move forward as if we are fearless to get to the other side.
What if we could step into our young adult skin and remember how it felt not to know what we now know? And with that memory comes the feeling. And with that feeling comes empathy and connection and the kind of support young adults need. Compassionate, not controlling, seeking to understand rather than judge. A small shift Alexis recommends is to offer options rather than answers, and ask the person how something feels rather than what they plan to do, because this creates the space they need to think for themselves. To do this, you have to look honestly at how your own fear is shaping your behaviour. And for those of us leading and parenting in midlife, that invites some honest reflection. Where could we do a better job of naming what's typical, so that young people can distinguish it from what's truly alarming? What can we normalise about the hard parts of growth without dismissing the real risks? And how can we offer the kind of companionship that gives young people permission to grow? Growth at any life stage is meant to feel uncomfortable. Our job isn't to smooth the path or tell a cleaner story, it's to hold our nerve, name what's normal, and let the young people in our lives, whether they're students, team members, or our own children, find their own way. You're there to give them enough room to fall and enough support to get up again. And remember, when your knees are shaking, be sure to plant your feet. Thank you for listening. Fearless Forward is edited and produced by Mark Steadman. I'll be back with you in 2 weeks for our next conversation about how leaders have faced their fears. To be sure of catching it, go to fearlessforward.org or subscribe to my weekly bulletin at skillfulleaders.com.